Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Finders Keepers Cowboy by Rachelle, Paige, Campbell. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Ryan Kincaid hated wasting time. Hank, his grandfather, called him impatient. His late grandmother Susie used to berate him for twitchy legs. If he had focused more on fixing the flaw at any point in his 38 years, he wouldn't have been in such a rush today. Could he have saved himself from nearly cutting off his finger? Probably. The day went downhill before he even got out of bed. The phone rang ahead of the alarm. Bring, bring, bring. The loud ringtone blared. He stifled the growl building in his throat. The peaceful tones he'd selected for his alarm gently should have roused him. The electronic chime blasted, drawing attention for the caller. Instead of sitting and reaching for his cell phone, he kept his head on the pillow and fumbled for the device on the nightstand. He swatted the phone off the smooth surface. It landed with a thud on the wooden floor. The phone stopped ringing. He turned his head to the cool side of the pillow. Good. Maybe he could get another few minutes of sleep. Under his four-post bed, the cell phone rang again, louder than before. Grumbling, he rolled out of bed and knelt on the floor. With his cheek pressed against the boards, he groped, his fingers connecting with the device near the back corner. Reaching, he caught the cell and tweaked his shoulder. Grunting, he retrieved the device and frowned at the screen. 2 missed calls from his ranch hand, Ted. In a rush, he pulled on his jeans and work shirt, groaning as his aching shoulder stretched. Downstairs in the kitchen, he operated on autopilot, brewing coffee without too much thought. He tapped a quick text message to Ted, grabbed a travel mug, and reached for the glass pot. He grabbed the carafe off the coffee maker too early. Hot coffee scalded his hand and spilled onto the floor. With paper towels, he soaked up the mess, but couldn't rid the room of the lingering stench of burnt coffee. He rinsed his hands with cold water. The icy chill did the caffeine's job, jolting him to full alertness. He wasn't sure he'd survive his next slip-up. He didn't wait to greet his grandfather to review the day's plans. Starting from the house, he was out the front door as the sun rose. With the opening day approaching and guests arriving soon, he didn't have time for pleasantries. His grandfather, a dyed-in-the-wool cowboy, would understand. Missing those moments with his grandfather, however, nagged Ryan for hours. Since losing Grandma, he never wanted to take a moment for granted. Their time together was too precious to let a single second slip past unremarked or a beautiful morning to go unnoticed. The Kincaids had been ranching outside Hurd, Montana since the 19th century. As one of the 3 founding families, their legacy was awash with intrigue and backstabbing. Eventually, they'd found stability and mutual respect with their only remaining neighbors, the Hawkes. Over the past decade, however, the Kincaids had been the last ranchers standing. And then Ryan had sold off the cattle and chased after an unexpected idea: high-end tourism. Hopping into his truck, he drove out to the former Hawke property in the site of the newest lodging for the ranch's guests. Grass stretched toward the horizon, unbroken and abundant in every direction. The ground rose and fell in gentle undulations. His property had been claimed by his forebears for its pond and the creek that ran through the eastern boundary, believing a false claim of gold. But this stretch of landscape had been coveted by many a Kincaid for its seeming infinity. He met up with Ted and the rest of the crew at the yurts. The traditional canvas tent home for nomadic tribes had been a unique choice for additional accommodation. Circular in shape, these structures both stuck out and blended into the rolling grass landscape. Set back from the new property line, he couldn't see his annoying neighbor Megan's house, nor could she see his. He didn't want to encroach on anyone's privacy, legal right or no. Sniggering, he shook his head. The woman would talk to his guests until they cried uncle and ran away, but he was steering clear. He wasn't some selfless neighbor, but a man looking out for his best interests. Since childhood, Megan had been an incessant chatterbox. Had she ever had a moment of quiet contemplation? Could she keep a thought or opinion to herself without blurting every idea to any passerby? Didn't she have friends for girl talk? He hated feeling cornered at every encounter. Of course, Hank didn't care. She was thick as thieves with his grandfather, always had been. In his youth, their bond stuck in Ryan's craw. Couldn't she spend her summer vacation with her family and leave his alone? Grandma had understood. She was quiet like Ryan. To his chagrin, Grandma, his staunchest ally, had found Meg charming in the sort of head-scratching, bewildering way he reasoned everyone must like her. He wanted peace. Meg craved chaos. Even now, when she wasn't physically close, she was stirring up his mind. He parked the truck, leaving the keys in the ignition and hopping out of the cab. He scanned the work site. Cupping hands around his mouth, he whistled. His lead ranch hand, Ted, and the two men hired for the summer turned their heads. Standing near the first of 3 yurts, they circled the erected frame. "How's it going?" Ryan called, strolling toward the group. Ted turned away from the men and strode toward the boss. "Glad to catch you. I haven't had luck finding a replacement yoga instructor with such short notice. Most of our backups have accepted other roles." Ryan nodded. He wasn't surprised. Before he turned the ranch into a resort, he wouldn't have imagined many in town had ever heard of the exercise discipline. Their corner of the world wasn't awash with yogis. "I asked Joe to put the word out at school. One of the teachers might have a hidden talent." Ted stroked his jaw. Joe was a middle school teacher and in the summers tour guide. His knowledge of the history of the ranches and herd was unparalleled. With a love for meeting new people, he was a natural for the part-time role. "Or you could fill in?" Ted grunted. Ryan chuckled and clapped a hand on the cowboy's shoulder. "Never say never, right?" "Sure, learned that since I started here." Dropping his hand, Ryan scrubbed his face. While he employed a few additional cowboys in the summer season to mend fences, maintain the property, and separate wildlife from guests, he mostly employed spa staff. The old bunkhouse was now co-ed, and Ted managed people more than animals. Life had definitely changed in ways unimaginable, even a generation earlier, when this land had been devoted to grazing cattle. "Never mind that problem. If someone doesn't turn up, I'll issue refunds for the classes already booked. I'll come up with something else to add to the schedule." "You could teach meditation." Ted chuckled. "How's the progress out here?" "Good. We're almost ready to stretch the campus over the frames," Ted said. Ryan grinned and rubbed his palms together. "I'm right on time." "You sure about this?" Ted tipped his head to the side. The question was fair. Ryan's latest venture wasn't a guaranteed success. When he'd first considered the idea of adding more campsites to the property, he'd hesitated. For a while, he'd been in discussions with several wildlife groups about reintroducing a bison herd to the town named for the grouping. If the environmental impact and ecological study was approved by Herd's town council at their meeting in the fall, the first bison would be introduced in the spring. The needs of the bison would take precedence on his land. He had no intention of swapping cattle for bison and raising the animals for profit. He wanted to restore the balance of nature to the ecosystem, and he'd be glad to let the animals take over the grass. Too much time and money had been spent on mowing and maintenance that the bison would handle for free. The yurts might last one season. Ryan understood and accepted the risk. When he decided to make reparations, he was prepared for the potentially expensive and short-term chance. He profited off a complicated family legacy of arrogance that settled the land and placed man's will above nature. His family had been at least partially responsible for the devastation of bison herds. The animals had been eradicated from the environment by force. Their treatment was only one in a long list of historic misdeeds. He was glad to do his small part to correct past wrongs, but he couldn't let fear of tomorrow's failure hold him back today. The ranch's lodging expansion was happening. "I'm ready. Show me what to do." He listened without comment to Ted's instructions on completing the yurts. While the tents were Ryan's idea, he had tasked Ted with deployment. Construction could be tricky and dangerous. Within a few minutes, Ryan proved his point. In the process of stretching the canvas over the first frame, he reached for his knife to slice the material. In a second, he lost his grip and plunged the blade too far. He yelped and swore. Holding the finger tight, he staunched the bleeding with his shirt. "You better clean up and find a bandage. I'll finish this," Ted said. "Can't have you bleeding over the yurts or dying of an infection on opening weekend." With a grumbled, muttered oath, Ryan nodded and retreated to his truck. He drove the rutted road toward the house, cradling his injured hand to his chest and steering with his right. Hitting each bump and dip jarred him, and he winced. At the fork to the house, he drove around back and slowed on the gravel drive leading to the barn. He kept a first aid kit on the shelf inside the doors for treating guests quickly. He couldn't remember where Band-Aids might be stashed inside the ranch house. He could ask Hank, but would probably bleed out before Hank finished some non-relevant antidote. His grandfather loved to spin a yarn. He parked next to the barn and frowned. Motion in his peripheral vision caught his attention. He snapped his head and spotted her. Megan. What in the world? He muttered, pocketing his keys and hopping from the vehicle. In a few quick strides, he reached the outbuilding Hank had assumed control of years back. The uninsulated man cave was not to be entered without express permission of its rightful laird, Hank Kincaid. Not that a person could sneak in. A chain strung through the door handle and an iron ring was secured with a lock. Ryan had never seen the key. He'd only been inside once with Grandma, and the visit lasted 10 seconds. Hank had packed the structure from floor to ceiling. Grandma and Ryan hadn't managed more than 3 steps inside. The collection didn't allow for a person to take their time and survey the contents. They had retreated, walking backwards to do so, and neither mentioned the shed again. Their determination withered with the reality of the project. Today, however, some clever person or rascally grandfather found a way inside. Stained cardboard boxes surrounded the shed's perimeter. With each step, he discovered more debris, and the throbbing in his temples increased. A pile of old magazines was stashed on a broken chair against the side of the shed. The furniture leaned to one side. Another few ounces of weight, the precarious stricture would tip, and the yellow pages would scatter. Breathing in through his nose, he willed a calm he didn't feel. Patience was a virtue he couldn't find. He had enough work to do without adding another project. Cleaning up after Hank's mess wasn't ideal on a good day, let alone when he didn't have the use of both hands and was under a time crunch. Surely the old man couldn't have gotten himself into this much trouble alone. He was no longer capable of this much physical labor in a relatively short amount of time. Shutting his eyes, Ryan shook his head and breathed deep. A familiar floral scent tickled his nostrils. High-pitched chatter danced in the air. He swallowed, the groan building in his throat. Frustration pounded in his forehead in time to his heartbeat. Why is Meg the root of all his problems? Of course, I had to take the chance, right? You understand, Meg said. Who was she talking to? His hand throbbed. Was Hank inside, listening to the inane prattle? Ryan stepped over the threshold and frowned. What is going on here? A low woof woof responded. He stood in the doorway, blocked the exit, and squinted into the dark interior. Without power, the outbuilding had no light source, making it hard to confirm if she was alone or not. Blinking, his eyes adjusted. At the back, Meg sat on the floor, a pink skirt floating around her like a gauzy cloud, and her arm wrapped around a salt and pepper-colored mid-sized dog. She cooed to the dog, glaring at the entrance. You scared her. What? He poked his chest with a finger and strode forward. Me? The dog howled. It's you? Who else? Is someone behind you? Are you hiding Hank? She turned to the dog. Shh, shh, Colby, it's okay. She returned her gaze to him. Hold out your hand. Excuse me? He drew back his chin. She trespassed on his property and he had the nerve to dictate orders? You heard me. She got to her feet, straightening and pulling back her shoulders. Hold out your hand. Colby needs to sniff you. She needs to know you're a friend. Am I? He frowned. Adding a dog bite to his list of injuries wasn't worth holding his ground against her. The black and white poodle mix was a stray Meg had rescued a few years ago. He'd worried she was getting herself in over her head by owning any dog, let alone one with unknown origins. Instead of telling her, however, he did the next best thing. He told Hank and let the old cowboy warn her off. Not that it had made any difference. It's okay, Colby. He's nice. She patted the dog on the top of the head. To animals. She studied him. He stared at her until she had the sense to glance away. The dog trotted forward, sniffing the air and wagging her tail. He held out his hand. She nosed his knuckles. The cold sensation caught him off guard, and he tightened his fist, wincing as he added pressure to his fresh wound. Oh, no, are you hurt? He sucked in a breath and raised his hand, elevating the fingers and holding it to his chest. She neared, stopping inches away. Hold out your hand. Can I see? Why? Because I can help. She rolled her eyes. You don't have to be the macho tough guy all the time. Is that what you think? She wanted to fling insults and accuse him of casual misogyny while destroying his land. Oh, stop shaking your head. Just hold out your hand and let me see, she insisted. You're not dressed for it. She wore some sort of floaty, flimsy pink dress with a jean jacket over top. She always wore the clothes she wanted and not what was suitable to the task. He wouldn't get anywhere arguing against her outfit. He tried that too many times over the years. She reached for him, grazing her fingers along the back of the hand resting near his collarbone. He left the top of his work shirt unbuttoned and revealed an inch of tough, tan skin on his neck. With the wide brim of his hat, he hadn't worried about overexposure until too late. Her light touch sent shockwaves through him. He stared at her hand. What would happen if he looked at her and acknowledged the strange surge pulsating between them? He didn't have time to ask the question, let alone learn the answer. If he didn't have a second to stop his finger from bleeding, he definitely didn't have another minute for the odd sensation stirred up with her subpar nursing skills. No, get out, he murmured. I'm sorry, did you say something? She tilted her head and sighed. Had she not heard him? He wasn't sure if he should laugh or cry. Leave, Meg. Now. He delivered the words with as much stoicism as he could muster. Don't know why you're here or what possessed you to trash my yard. In 5 days, the first guests arrive. You have single-handedly added hours to my day. I know you don't like me, but why are you sabotaging my ranch? The tourists who stay here spend plenty of their dollars in towns at stores like yours. He kept his voice steady, never raising to any level that might be misconstrued as yelling, but he wanted no misunderstanding about his seriousness. Red-cheeked, she straightened, flaring her nostrils. Hank invited me. He asked for my help. Well, he didn't tell me. If he wasn't annoyed, he'd admire her backbone. Instead of shrinking, she stood tall and held his gaze. He wasn't sure about what was worse, the uninvited, stubborn woman on his property or his secretive, rule-breaking grandfather. While running a business together, they'd established one very important rule: talk to each other. Hank, his grandfather, had not kept Ryan informed today. I'm asking you to go. He lifted his injured hand high on his chest, shielding the wound from view, but redirecting the blood flow back into the limb. She pulled back her shoulders and took in a breath. Here comes the wind-up. He knew her cues and didn't want the fight she was readying for. He wanted so many other things. Top of his list, he sought every ounce of serenity he could muster in the dwindling days of solitude on the ranch. Once the resort opened for the summer, his house would be a revolving door of guests and staff. No inch of his 10,000 acres would be spared from incessant chatter. For a loner, he chose a shocking new direction for family business. If he righted some past wrongs and saved the land for another generation, every sacrifice would be worth the effort. Okay, I'll go. She held up her hands, palms facing out. You can tell Hank you ran me off. I'll leave the cleanup to you and Ted. Come on, Colby. Let's head to the store. We've got a business to run. If rumors were to be believed, her words weren't mere segue to escape an uncomfortable situation. He'd never seen much of a crowd or an antique store. Was she struggling? He almost asked. Neighbors helped each other here, but he was too frustrated to form the words. With the dog at her heels, she strode down the significantly widened center aisle. The shed's very own equator had been transformed from a thin line to several feet wide. For the first time, he spotted the plywood floor, a mismatch of different scraps unified by a dark stain. If he didn't have junk littering the lawn he wanted to mow, he'd be impressed by her handiwork. She must have been the one to clear the path. Hank couldn't be decisive about his things. She'd moved quick on sorting the items. Hank picked the right person for the job. The man needed to learn how to choose a better moment. She reached the door. Her light lavender perfume wafted on the cool late spring breeze. He breathed in the scent and studied her. Her chin trembled and her hands shook. She was too delicate for ranch life. Every year he expected her to cut ties and run. She was slight and pretty. She wasn't a Western woman. He'd known that since childhood. The day she finally realized she might find real purpose in her life somewhere far away, he'd cheer if he didn't fear she'd take that as encouragement to stay. Now he stepped to the side. She exited. The dog sniffed his hand and licked his palm. The sandpaper tongue tickled his lifeline, and he jumped. He'd have to teach the pet what her owner already knew. He was tough and unyielding. He had to be. He had no room for sweetness or sentimentality. His life dealt in absolutes, and she was all murky grays. He stared straight ahead, not daring in turn and glanced her way. He stayed in place, counting to 1,000. At 1,001, he turned and spotted his grandfather strolling down the path. Hank held up both hands. You scared her away? His tone was incredulous. Scared? Ryan would laugh if he wasn't so annoyed. Meg Hawke was intimidated by nothing and no one. You know, this is the worst time to start a project. Why send her here? She always gets in the way. He folded his arms over his chest. I have my reasons. Hank stopped a few yards away and pointed. You want to bandage that cut before you start hauling everything back? Or maybe you should apologize to her first. Be mad at me, not Meg. I called her. Why? He muttered the word like he had snuck in a swear. On the best days, Hank was entertaining. At his worst, he was exasperating. You've been mad at me about this mess for years. She has a business that could help me out. It's a win-win. You waste your energy searching for any reason to not like that girl. You're about the only person around who doesn't. If that was true, why does she spend her time alone? Arguing with a stubborn grandfather wouldn't do any good. Maybe the problem is I see her too clearly. Or maybe you're the fool who can't see himself for what and who he is. Ryan held perfectly still, his injured finger throbbing in time to his pounding heart. If Hank wanted to illuminate who Ryan was, he'd listen. Most days he kept his head down, racing from one task to the next. Focused on the business and the community, he'd admit he lost himself somewhere along the way. A roadmap or instruction manual would be welcome if Hank had either handy. Meeting his grandfather's steady stare, however, he nearly shuddered. In a single look, Ryan traveled back through time and was again the lost child, alone except for his grandparents. Disappointing his grandfather remained the worst sin. Hank raised him better than to lash out at a longtime neighbor and accuse her of trespassing without cause. Ryan entered the shed burning with 100 other frustrations that didn't involve Meg. She hadn't deserved his tirade. He shamed his family with the outburst. Hank nodded slowly. Come on, let's get you fixed. Then you can call Ted to help you clean the yard. I'll leave it to you to figure out how to apologize and get her back out here. We don't have all the time in the world for my project. Don't I know it? I'm not saying I'm sorry. Pardon? Hank narrowed his gaze. If you don't make time to do the right thing, you'll regret it. Exhaling a sigh, Ryan sagged his shoulders. Why couldn't he have one exchange with Meg that didn't end in total frustration? He couldn't shake off Hank's words. For no reason, he'd been mean. Hank was right. Ryan owed her an apology. I'm not running over there today. I'm too busy. Maybe you can't go tonight. Fine. You've got chores. But you need to make amends sooner than later. Hank strode away. Ryan studied the ground. He wouldn't pretend he wanted a friendship with the girl who'd always gotten under his skin. For the honor of his family name, he'd admit he'd been wrong. First time for everything, since he was always right.